We are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very important main stage session of Community Week. So, today we're going to be talking about a subject that's not only really close to my heart, but that affects millions of young students across the world every single day. So, at Wakelet, we're really proud of how diverse and international our community is, right? And there's so many different cultures and races and religions and genders and ethnicities represented in our community. So it's really important to discuss certain issues in a really clear, raw, and authentic way. Now, for this session, your participation is key, right? We want to hear from all of you about your experiences. We want to hear about new things that you've learned. So make sure to share all the new things that you've learned with us in the comments or on Twitter using the hashtag Wakelet Community Week, because it's all about learning this session. So this evening, we're going to be talking about culturally responsive learning. And I know that this is a phrase that many of you have probably seen being used in the past year, and myself included. And I never really knew what it meant fully until I had a completely eye-opening conversation with our guest tonight, Yaritza Villalba. Now, Yaritza has made such an impact when it comes to not only promoting culturally responsive teaching, but also highlighting the inequities in the education system. And I really, really hope that, just like me, tonight you'll all learn some life lessons and a new level of mindfulness and understanding to take with you into the next school year. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Yaritza to the stream. Hey, Yaritza, how's it going?
Hey, Rispa. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here.
I know, likewise. I've been looking forward to this like 4 weeks ago. Like this is the one session which I've really, really been looking forward to because I know that I'm going to learn so much. Yaritza, tell us a little bit about yourself for the folks at home who may not have met you before.
So, I'm Yaritzas Villalba. I've been teaching for 11 years here in New York City. I currently teach AP US History and US History to transfer school students. So, my students' ages range from 16 to 21. Um, I teach history. I believe that I'm a culturally responsive teacher. I dig deep into, cultural awareness, but also what is the reality of teaching, especially teaching during a pandemic. So I am looking forward to this conversation with Miss Spa and actually with all of you guys.
Likewise, and I think that one of the things which I really love about this is that me myself, I've got a personal stake in this because I've obviously seen you online. This is one of the reasons why we approached you, is that I've seen you online talking about culturally responsive teaching, and at Wakelet we kind of feel like we've got the finger on the pulse when it comes to things which are happening in education and edtech. But this one's particularly close to my heart, so I wanted to bring it right back and start right at the very beginning. Okay, so we've noticed you. I think that a lot of people probably recognize you online. When it comes to this subject, what can you define what culturally responsive teaching is for those people in the chat who've never heard the term before and don't understand what it is?
Sure. So, culture responsive teaching is a practice of connecting a student's culture, a language, their belief, their life experiences with what you're teaching in the classroom. So, it's just put in simple terms, it's the best practice of just incorporating your students into what you're teaching them daily.
And could you give us a few examples of what culturally inappropriate teaching is? Because I think that quite a lot of the time, when we're uncovering subjects like this, there's things which teachers may do in the classroom and things which people just might do in society in the classroom, which they might not consider insensitive or may not consider the feelings of others just because they've not been educated and we're a little bit ignorant to it. So what would be an example of a culturally inappropriate thing to happen in a classroom, let's say?
So, just thinking about my own experiences, I believe the number one culturally inappropriate thing or teaching experience that I know I went through when I was in junior high school was celebrating Cultural Awareness Day. It made me feel like the teacher was only acknowledging our differences and our interests and what made us unique one day out of the school year. And a lot of us as teachers, when we think about cultural awareness, we really want to give students that opportunity to share their beliefs or share their traditions. But just think about it. You're only doing it one day out of the entire school year. You're only allowing students to share their experiences one day as opposed to the 300 days within that school year. I believe that is inappropriate. Another one is, and I know a lot of people are going to give pushback for this one, celebrating Black History Month as opposed to recognizing that Black history is every single day of the year, regardless of what country you're in. Even Indigenous Peoples Day or Women's Day or Women's Month. I believe that, you know, now that times are changing, people have to acknowledge there's a flaws in our system, and we have to really change those flaws. And just celebrating, you know, groups of people for 1 month or for 1 day, to me, is very inappropriate.
And what do you say to the people who think that, like, well, this is being able to celebrate those days are important because it gives like a, how can I say this? It highlights perhaps some of the inequities that people are facing that they may not have felt otherwise, they may not have seen otherwise.
I think that it should be done 365 days a year. To me, it's almost like, you know, people are born around the world every single year. No one has the same birthday. We don't celebrate everyone's birthday on the same day, right? We acknowledge that people are born different times of the year, months, or even times itself. And that's, to me, the same as celebrating Black History Month or celebrating Women's History Month. It has to be done in a way where you're acknowledging that, you know, these are people with unique experiences who have shaped countries, not just the United States, but they have done it all year round. You know, women were not protesting the right to vote just 1 month. You know, African Americans or even Africans did not fight to end slavery just 1 month. It was 400 years of discrimination and 400 years of inequities, and we're still dealing with that today. So people have to acknowledge that though times have changed, you can't just sit there and say that 1 day is enough to acknowledge, you know, what people have been through and what people are still going through today.
And so, like, when it comes to culturally responsive teaching, right? What effect does it have on a student in a classroom that may be facing this without knowing? Like, if culturally responsive teaching isn't being applied by the teacher in a particular classroom at any given time, how is that going to make a student feel if they don't see themselves represented in the stuff that they're learning?
So I actually want to change that question a bit. So since we're, you know, talking to educators and educators are watching, and I just want everyone to think about a time where, what if the administrators never acknowledged you by your name? What if administrators celebrated events that had nothing to do with you? There was a total disconnect. How would that make you feel? Would you still come to work, you know, giving 100% and you're top notch at your practices? Would you still feel like you're a part of that community? Well, students feel the same exact way. When you don't incorporate their interests or their language or their beliefs or their traditions into what you're teaching, you're basically saying, this text was not made for you. This curriculum has nothing to do with you. And that's where I believe we're failing students. The idea of culturally responsive teaching is to enhance practices, but also it's to lead to academic success. You know, sometimes folks hear culturally responsive teaching and the first thing that comes to their mind is just music and fun. And how do I make this kid laugh? But the idea is, how do I include this kid, or how do I include these groups of people? Because families should be acknowledged in culturally responsive teaching as well. How do I include these groups of people and help them towards academic success? How is me acknowledging that if I write a mathematical equation on exploration of space, but you have never been introduced to the exploration of space, you don't even know, you know, what that may look like, how do I expect you to fully understand this question and to fully be able to even write an equation from this problem? So I believe teachers have to really see that connection between what it feels like to be included and how it makes you feel when administration actually includes you into your daily tasks.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I ask is that, like, I myself come from like a mixed background, and, you know, very sort of ethnically ambiguous. And, you know, I've dealt with a lot of stuff growing up in school, you know, people mispronouncing my name, not quite knowing where I am, not quite knowing how to behave around me, not quite knowing like what they could say that could potentially offend me, right? That's the thing. Like, I've always sort of never had like a very strong racial alignment, if you might say. It's always been very sort of all over the place. But myself, I always remember when I was in school, I never really had an instance whereby I would, you know, find anything on the curriculum or anything that educators were kind of, you know, teaching me where I was represented. You know, when we were learning about history, when we were learning about geography, whatever it might be, I never really felt like I was represented in the things that I was learning. It almost felt like I was learning about somebody else's history as opposed to mine. Even though like I'm in the UK and I was sort of, you know, learning about my history, there was still like a sense of detachment. So like what kind of steps do you think that teachers can take to you know, remove that feeling from students? Like what, and also like, what about teachers who may be watching this right now who think, you know, I simply do not have the time to learn how to pronounce every single one of my students' name. I don't have the time to kind of explore, you know, every single one of my students' heritage to find whether or not, you know, I should do this or that. What kind of message? It's kind of like a double question, right? Like what kind of message would you have to educators like that? And you know, yeah, that's it really. The other question we covered already.
So we did tell everyone that this is going to be a raw conversation. And I feel like if you don't have the time to figure out how to pronounce a student's name or their life experiences, then you shouldn't be a teacher. There's no way that you can teach a student if you don't know who they are. It's almost like walking into a room of individuals at work and no one acknowledges that you're there. No one pronounces your name correctly. Yeah. Like I know if that was my experience, I would feel very uncomfortable working there. But also you mentioned text that, you know, did not, it wasn't really diverse. It did not include everyone. And that's what we call colonized text, right? And so when I think about curricula, I've had the opportunity to create my own curricula, which I believe I'm very fortunate for it, because my number one belief is that students are the experts. So for the teachers who even say, you know, I have no time to do research, the experts are in front of you. Ask them what would they like to learn. And even if you know you have to stick to certain standards, you need to truly understand that standards are the basis for what you're supposed to teach, not how you're supposed to teach, right? And so we have to take what's given to us by the Department of Education, right? And we had to make it our own to fit who our students are. Ask your students questions. Every student is not the same, whether you teach in a diverse classroom or not. Even if a kid shares the same socioeconomic status, even if you have a classroom full of 30 students with the same GPA, I promise you, they are still uniquely different. It is up to you to figure out how and why, because that is actually what sets them apart. And students want you to acknowledge those differences. They want you to say, hey, Lorenzo, I heard that you was listening to Southside yesterday. Why is that your favorite song? Or, hey, Tate, I remember that you discussed this specific behavior, and I want to know how come you keep popping rubber bands on your wrists. We have to acknowledge that differences exist within our classrooms, because honestly, that's the only way we can teach. You know, this is not 1970s anymore. You know, tables don't have to be in rows, even though they were for the pandemic. Times have changed. And if you are still teaching that way, you are doing a disservice to our students.
It's just amazing to hear you say these things, honestly, Ritz. And I know that when we had our conversation, we had a brief conversation, I think it was, around 2 weeks ago about the session. And I remember being fascinated about your experience as well, growing up in school, and, you know, the kind of connections that you made from your experiences then to the things that you're kind of, you know, working towards now. Could you share like what your experiences were in school? Because I know that you've got quite an interesting background, right?
Yes. So I was born in Panama, Colón, Calle Cinco de Balboa. And my family migrated here in 1991. So we migrated here to Brooklyn, New York. And when I began public school, obviously, for those of you who are educators, you know that students who speak a second language are usually classified as English as a second language learner. And so from the time that I began public school all until high school, I was classified as an English as a second language learner. And honestly, and I know I keep using this word, but they really did a disservice to me. My mom signed papers that allowed the schools to actually put me in those classes, those ESL classes. I thought, and I still believe that, you know, my English was pretty good because I was predominantly an English spoken person. And just my experience in school, when I hit high school, I had taken these ESL classes, and in high school, they called them native. And so here I am in these classes with students who just came to America. At this point, I've been here for, over 10 years. And I'm experiencing not being able to speak English within that class. The teacher only spoke Spanish. Everyone was from different places, different Latin countries. And I never had the opportunity to be with other students. I was forced to be in this class for the 4 years of high school. And my teacher, I love her to death, Senora Gaetan, she was the best. But I don't think that she understood that I felt alienated. I felt like I wasn't a part of it. And I knew becoming a teacher that schools actually made more money from me being an ESL student as opposed to a gen ed student. And so when I became a teacher, I was like, oh, okay, so this is why they kept me as an ESL student, as opposed to letting my mom know that she could actually sign paperwork to take me out of the class. So from the time I was in kindergarten to the time I graduated high school, I was in ESL classes that, funny as it sounds, spoke predominantly Spanish and not English.
It's such a bizarre situation to be caught up in. It's like you've just been caught in a system that is like for profit, and it's like I don't know how you must have felt knowing that your value was was higher as an ESL student than just as like taking English as like a regular class. I mean, and a lot of students are feeling like this every single day, right? I mean, not necessarily in the exact same situation, but through the curriculums that are kind of being sent through the schools. And this is a question which I find really, really interesting. The next question: do you feel like there are certain subjects, whether it's history, whether it's English language, whether it's geography, whatever it might be, and some may argue even some other disciplines as well, like science and mathematics, whatever. Do you feel like those curriculums are still kind of seen through like a Western, white, European lens? And if so, why? And what can we do as like a community of individuals to try and change that? Where does that change start?
Well, of course. we have to think about who controls what we teach and how we teach, right? Teachers usually go through these master's programs where professors, no disrespect to the professors out there, are teaching old curricula, right? They've been professors for about 15 to 30 years. They have this one way that teachers should graduate and go into the classroom and teach. And it's not really preparing us for reality. It's preparing us to keep buying books and believing that every single book that I read is going to give me the answer for teaching a diverse or a class that's, predominantly white. And honestly, once we get into the classroom, we see that there's a huge disconnect. The curriculums that have been made, and I've seen curriculums when I first started teaching 11 years ago, the curriculum that was handed to me, I honestly couldn't understand it. I didn't understand why the curriculum started with slavery in America as opposed to the achievements and the successes of Africans in Africa. I didn't understand why we didn't talk about the Ice Age and the impact that it had with migrations or, Asians coming to America and then, becoming Native Americans. I didn't understand why we weren't teaching students the reality of race and culture. And so what I would say is, we still have a curriculum that is very colonized, that is very European centered, and that is a major problem for most of us, regardless of what country you are in. If you take a step back and you look at what you're teaching, you'll notice you yourself as a teacher is not even included. Right. So we think about these 21st century practices. We think about with the pandemic, how many of us have began to use technology and infuse different platforms. If you look at your curriculum, it doesn't have space for any of that. It basically just says, you start at this date, you finish at this date, you give several exams, and then that is it. It doesn't really give you room to have students experiment or to have students explore, to have students ask questions, because when you think about the European centered curricula, it's not about equality or equity. It's about just finishing something. It's about preparing you for what they deem as life after high school, which is not preparing you for a job. It's just preparing you for higher education, which is college, right? So now we're talking about more money and dismissing the fact that most of our students are not even going to go to college. Most of our students don't like reading books. Most of our students don't want to read these books that are very old and are telling stories from one perspective as opposed to the many perspectives. Yes, we definitely do need to teach for the future, Christine. We definitely do. And the way we do that is by asking questions. If you're still using the same curricula that you used when you first started teaching, that is a problem. We just endured a pandemic. We just endured a pandemic, which means everything needs to shift, regardless of if you place SEL in it, regardless of if you become more culturally aware. It has to change. It has to match who the students are within your classroom and how we're going to actually turn them into little scientists, right? Because they could be scientists and still study any discipline. They can study math, they can study history, but it's how do we allow them to explore? What are you creating for your students? What are you allowing them to create for your curriculum? Yeah, I know I just said a mouthful.
No. I'm literally digesting everything that you're saying, and it makes so much sense. Honestly, I think I said this in one of my previous sessions, is that I love it when you have like a feeling and a thought in your head that, is kind of, it's just entrenched in there. But then when you finally hear somebody actually articulate it in a way that, you may not have been able to, it makes so much sense and it's really powerful. And, I hope everybody in the audience kind of feels the same way as well. And please keep the comments and the questions coming, like this is a place for us to kind of learn and understand things. And, you can't get comfortable with something unless you first get uncomfortable with it. There's no growing, there's no learning without being uncomfortable. So please, any questions, ask them, and I'm sure that Yaritza will definitely dissect them and have a look at them. Yaritza, sure. You mentioned one thing in the last question which kind of struck a nerve with me, which was when we're teaching young students things like slavery, for example, an example like that. You may have a student of, a child of color who's being taught about slavery by, a white person. They may feel already that disconnect. You mentioned this idea of like trauma, like a subtle sort of trauma that students may feel when they're being exposed to certain things from a particular lens. Could you expand a little bit on that? Because I know we had an amazing conversation about it previously.
Yeah. So humans consciously and unconsciously store experiences in their brains, right? And those experiences are what impacts how we learn, how we problem solve, and how we communicate. So I just need teachers to imagine having students relive through trauma. And sometimes the history that we teach, whether if it's slavery, whether if it's the Chinese Revolution, whether if it's the war in Iraq, I just need teachers to think about how students' experiences are going to impact how they learn, but also how they respond to things in the classroom. As teachers, yes, it is our job to expose students to not only what's happening around them, but what has happened in the past, whether this is science or math. We still give a lot of examples as to what's happening in the real world, right? That connection to real world experiences. But we tend to forget that those stored experiences are going to impact students' responses. Now, you may have some students who rebel against what you're teaching, and it's not because they dislike it, but it's probably how you presented it.
Right.
And so if I had a family member who was a Tuskegee Airman, right? And I know my grandfather did enormous things for the United States. But when my teacher taught about the Tuskegee Airmen, she only probably said like 2 sentences and probably did not even connect it to today, connected to me, or even connected positively to the United States itself and the contributions of African Americans. How am I going to feel? I'm going to feel as if that teacher didn't do her homework. I'm going to feel as if you just you left me out of a piece of history that I believe that I fit into because that was my grandparent. And as teachers, sometimes, we need to start to dissect what we're teaching. Yes, it's cool if you've memorized your whole curriculum and you've memorized textbooks, but honestly, what does that have to do with the students that you're teaching? Reliving trauma. And everybody knows this. If you got into a car accident before, it may take you some time to get back into that car. You never know what students are truly enduring. You never know what has been taught to that student while they were home. And so you have to be very equipped to teach things like history to students, because you never know their reaction. So that whole, concept of consciously and unconsciously storing your experiences, even adults do it. We do it all the time. If I was in a relationship with someone and things went totally wrong, I may go into the next relationship tiptoeing because I know I've had this bad experience with this one person, and so I don't want to experience that again. That is what our students are enduring. Think about Black Lives Matter. This is a movement that, yes, it began in the United States, but this was something that was shared all over the world. And when teachers discuss it, I don't think we truly give or acknowledge the fact that African Americans have been protesting inequities forever. So now we have another movement, and I don't think that teachers are doing their homework. I don't think we're thinking about the civil rights movement. I don't think that we're thinking about, the Freedmen's School. I don't think that we're doing our history and making those connections and actually letting our students of color know that, it's okay if you're not comfortable. Speak, share how you truly feel, because that is the only way to create equity within your classroom.
That is, it's so interesting that you just said that, because that's one of the questions which I was sort of preparing in my brain as you were saying that was, how can you create an environment where your students feel comfortable enough to come out and say that they don't feel included in the things that you may be teaching them, or they don't feel included in the in the conversation, even, because that story that you just said then, it must have been felt horrible, to have a major part of a major conflict where that one of your family members served, and it's not even mentioned. Like, it must have felt really horrible. So can teachers do anything to create an environment with their students where these things are discussed openly and honestly? And also, I know that the next thing is going to be that there's probably going to be loads of teachers who are in their minds thinking like that's going to be chaos. Like, how am I going to do that? Like, I'm going to have to kind of maybe go against the school with this. There's processes to these kind of things, whatever it might be. How do you create that environment for students to feel empowered to be able to say those things?
So I would say the first thing is don't take it personal. don't take it personal. But also, when you think of equity in schools, the first thing that should come to mind is having an environment that is filled with open-mindedness. Each student should respect the differences, should respect the different cultures and beliefs that's within that classroom. As a teacher, you can create an open space. You can, and like I said, don't take it personally. You can ask a question or open-ended question and just allow students to discuss. What you'll find is that, first of all, our students are very mature. I believe I read somewhere last week that, if students are mature enough to endure racism, they are mature enough to learn about it and discuss it. And that's exactly how I feel. If we have students of color in every country experiencing discrimination and racism, then why can't they have discussions around it? Whether your school board is against it or not, we're honestly in an era where we need students to express themselves. We need other students to be able to take in what they hear. So even if they themselves, because of whatever reason, haven't endured racism, now they see what it feels like, but also they can acknowledge, hey, you went through this. I am sorry about this. There's too many times where I run into adults who, even speaking about culturally responsive teaching, they tie it in with race. And I try to let them know that race and culture is two different things. With race, you're looking at this physical and social qualities, right. Ancestry. With culture, you're thinking ideas, you're thinking behavior, you're thinking beliefs, you're thinking traditions. For a large group of people, that's transmitted from generation to generation to generation. And so you have to think about even how our environment impacts who we are. And I don't believe we're doing a good job about that. So if we had to blame anyone, because technically life is a blame game, we have to blame ourselves as teachers. We have to blame ourselves as administrators. We have to blame ourselves as district representatives, because it's a trickle-down effect. If you as a teacher don't ask questions, administrators won't ask questions, district representatives won't ask questions, state legislatures won't ask questions, because they'll assume everything is fine.
Right.
And then you're doing that disservice to students and families once again.
Right. And that's a really interesting point as well, Yaritza, because like, where do you think that this comes from? Is it obviously there's going to be situations, I think, where, a teacher's own, prejudices may get in the way of them, effectively teaching and including certain students from different races and different ethnicities, different cultures in the conversation. But where does this problem start initially? And like where do we campaign for change? I know that you just mentioned it's the teacher's kind of job to do that, and then by the teachers asking that question, it will trickle up. But where's the genesis for all this? Like, does it start on a much wider scale? Is it a political thing? Is it a geopolitical thing that trickles down to politics, and then government, and then the school system, and then eventually the teacher? Or is it something different?
I think it's definitely a geopolitical thing. When we think about where we are in certain places of the world, that definitely impacts the politics, that definitely impacts the international affairs, and it definitely impacts what we teach within that school, right? Because we have to think about who has full control of the nation, right? Whether the states or the federal government or a king or a queen or a prince or a princess. We have to think about that, and we have to take that into account. But even we have to think about even what role religion plays in education. Yeah. So when we think about what we teach students, how we teach students, and how we service students, we have to be very mindful to first reflect on what we're doing as teachers. Now, if you went into the classroom and you're saying, hey, this does not reflect who my students are, this does not include my students, my classroom doesn't even include my students, this text that I'm having students read doesn't include my students, and you make that move for change, then for sure you're doing the right thing. This is more for those people who are they're content with not including everyone within that curriculum. They're content with not asking questions. I love to ask questions, and I know that sometimes I make a lot of people angry, but I'd rather make you angry by saying the honest truth than to live in a lie and then look at my students and say, well, we have to read this book because this is the only book that the school has. Folks have to become more realistic about addressing all of these issues that exist. And the only way we're going to do that is by asking questions. If your students cannot speak for themselves, you're the second best thing. You are the runner-up. You have to speak and advocate for your students. Your voice needs to be heard. And since last year, we started to see a lot of folks doing that, especially around text, especially around curriculum. But now we need a lot more folks in every country, because I know there's places in West Africa where they still have colonized text and they don't have control of the curriculum. Well, let's get that control. How can we in other countries inspire that change in West Africa or South Africa? What are we doing as a people to enhance learning in other countries, regardless of, the demographics being the same within that school? At the end of the day, every child needs to learn about differences and acknowledge that differences are literally what ties us together as a nation. And this is the history teacher in me. When you think about the Silk Road, or even when you think about the now, right? People communicated with each other. They traded ideas, they traded beliefs. And that's how we have this whole idea of cultural diffusion. This is what the world is. It's a whole huge melting pot, whether we like it or not. Folks are beginning to travel a lot more. So how do you show your students how to accept differences?
And it's quite interesting as well, because I love, and I know that a lot of people in the chat are celebrating the fact that you're making this clear distinction between culture and race. And I think it's an important one as well, because you can go anywhere on earth and there's going to be prejudice, there's going to be a discrimination, and you can go to places where it's literally one race of people, and yet within that race there's still a lot of discrimination and social hierarchies and whatever it might be. These can be political, they can be religious, they can be just depending on where you are. I know I said this earlier. It's I think it was Freud who kind of came up with this theory that there's a strange phenomena that happens where people tend to be tend to notice the differences between them and their neighbor than they do themselves and somebody from halfway around the world. It's a strange thing. It's like if you're in a particular country and somebody comes in who's clearly not from that country, you forgive their mistakes, you kind of welcome them, you're curious, you want to know what their culture is. But then the neighbor, the person next door who may have a different religion from you, who may have a different code of belief or ethics, or may literally just be from a different city in the country that you're in, you know, you're going to discriminate against. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know that we've got a very, very global audience here at Wakelet. You know, it's one of the things that makes the community so special is its diversity. But there are definitely going to be educators out there who are literally just going to be teaching a class full of white kids or a class full of, you know, Arab kids or whatever it might be. And they may not necessarily see things as simple as, you know, they might be looking at things solely through the lens of race, when actually there's plenty of other cultural divides as well that they have to be responsible about. So I'd love you to go into that a little bit.
So first, I want to acknowledge that teachers affect students. So just as well as parents affect students, teachers affect students because they're spending half of their days with us. So in order for us to change how this world has been for centuries, we must first acknowledge that, you know, inequities do exist. So if you do have a classroom where, as I mentioned before, the socioeconomic is the same, you may have all white males or all white females or all black males or all black females, all Asian males, all Asian females, and the list goes on. And you don't teach differences and you don't teach acceptance. That is a huge issue. As the world begins to open up again, and as it has for years now, as you mentioned, people are traveling more. People are not only traveling to different countries, but asking questions about religion. The media is portraying religion and differences in a way where some of us might agree or disagree. War has broken out in many countries, and some of us are failing to accept that our students need to know about those things. And so I've never had the opportunity to teach an all male or all female classroom, thank God. But for those of you who do, the first thing you may want to do is, aside from their gender or their race or even their handwriting, right? Because some of us have stereotypes about students' handwritings. You may want to ask that student, who are you? Who are you? I think that is a question that even adults don't know how to answer just yet, because some of us in our 30s are just finding out who we are. Because once you hear the different stories of who are you, why are you here, what can you tell me about yourself beyond what this GPA states, then you'll figure out that your classroom is totally different from what you expected and totally different from all the stereotypes and biases you had. You'll figure out that it's easier to plan your lessons, but also teaching acceptance is much easier because now students will notice that they may look the same, but they're totally different. You may be my neighbor, and our parents may make the same. They have the same kind of careers. We go to the same school. I've been in the preschool with you. We wear the same uniform. But behind all of that, all of the physical appearances and all the social structures, we're totally different. And that goes for any country. And this is why culturally responsive teaching is important, because you want students to acknowledge their differences. I went to college upstate New York, and that was my first time actually sitting in a classroom with white people, with Caucasians, with Asians. My freshman year, I was just like, wait, what? Here is this, Black girl from Brooklyn in a classroom, speaking of cultural diffusion and diversity. I was like, what is this? Right? But I had a parent who was very open-minded about every culture, who was very open-minded about religion, who wasn't afraid to let me speak to the person next door, who didn't tell me to be quiet when I asked questions. And so even though school didn't prepare me for my education classes, I was prepared as a teenager going into college to accept the differences that I saw, and I wasn't afraid to ask questions. So yes, I wanted to know why certain students used different pots for rice, and yes, I wanted to know why there were so many different organizations where letters that I didn't even, Roman numeral letters that I didn't even understand. I wasn't afraid to put myself out there because I had already been taught acceptance. And so teachers, it's also your job to teach acceptance to students. And you have to give away to those stereotypes that you have when you first see a student's name, or when you walk into the classroom and everyone looks the same. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are the same.
And you hit on an interesting point there as well, which is like the role that parents play in all of this. Parents, like you said, parents carry with them their own prejudices. They may be from a different time, that kind of thing. And obviously the effect that parents have on this, the kids is absolutely profound. Is there any sort of like reach out that you can do with parents to involve them in the subject and help them understand and educate them as well? Because what's happening, I think, more and more often is, I don't want to really call it like a sense of rebellion, but there's definitely this idea of, because students are way more plugged in to the things which are going on nowadays, when it comes to equity, when it comes to race, when it comes to culture, they are sort of educating their parents on this, and it's coming from the student. Is there anything that teachers can do to bring the parents into the fold of this and help them understand some of the issues that they may be passing on to their kids?
So I'll actually start with my experience. As I mentioned to you guys before, I was born in Panama, which means when I came to this country, it was during the Panamanian invasion. The United States invaded Panama. And so when you speak of Panamanians and Americans, my mom would give you, her experience living in Panama during the invasion. And when I became a teacher, I used to read about, Panama and the Panama Canal in the history books. And it was only like this small little paragraph. And I disliked it so much because I felt like, wow, I'm not even teaching my own history to these students. And I remember sitting down with my mom and truly getting an understanding of why she felt some way towards the United States military and United States government, but also why she decided to still migrate here. And that changed my entire perspective on teaching as a history teacher. Because if you only teach your students one perspective, they will only remember that one perspective, which truly, if you think about experiences and negative experiences that our parents have had, it teaches you almost like hate. Right. So when I began to teach my students about my mom's experience and my experience as a baby that I obviously didn't know, it gave students another perspective beyond what the textbook stated. So the students learned more about white man's burden, but I also acknowledged, hey, the Panamanians technically didn't ask for help. The Americans took advantage of it. We got a canal out of it, but it didn't become ours until years later. And I think that teachers, when you're explaining to parents just, I guess, the power of being real and being authentic, it's very important to say, yes, you have your opinion, and yes, you have your experiences, but what are the facts? And also allow your students to tell you their opinion and experiences, but also facts. As a teacher, it's important that we teach facts. You let the students express their opinions. It's your job to teach the facts, because to me, the facts are the basis for everything, right? I can't argue with someone. I can't debate with someone if I can't back it up or support it. Yes, I can say today the sky is orange. But you may look up and you may say, Yaritza, it's kind of a grayish, right? But I need the facts. We have to look at it together and figure out what color that is. And that's honestly what we need to do with parents as well. We can't just say, hey, you're totally wrong. We have to say, okay, so here's a piece of information as well. We have to educate parents as well, because they're within that community.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important things. Like I said, there's kind of like generational divides. And I think one of the really cool things about kind of being in this era is that, yeah, there's so many issues that are affecting us, you know. And it's like we now, I think that more and more people are feeling empowered, and that's a really important thing. And I think that it takes, God, it's taken so much. I mean, it is quite depressing that we're still having conversations like this today. You know what I mean? And then you think back and you realize that actually it's not really ancient history. You know, the prejudices, you know, has been built into politics and built into society for such a long time that it feels like we're almost, you know, we're still getting used to being free from the shackles of it. So yeah, I think that that's a great way to definitely, you know, include parents in the conversation. I saw a few comments as well talking about like celebrating the differences in culture. You know, I think that that's a really important thing. And I remember me saying this to you. I was like, you know, culture is one of those things where like the things that can be celebrated, the things that should be celebrated, the fun things, the light things, the things that actually do bond each other and connect people from different, you know, different cultures are things like the food, things like the music, you know, things like the local customs. And I think that that's where culture is beautiful. I think that culture can sometimes play quite a it can sometimes be negative. Let's be honest. You know, there are many cultures around the world that, you know, they engage in pretty bad stuff because it's the culture. Yeah. However, you know, there's the flip side of that, which is, like I said, the light stuff, the music, the you know, the costume, the pageantry, that kind of thing. How do educators celebrate those things without being inappropriate, with being respectful to the heritage and the cultures of students?
I would say let the students decide how they want to celebrate their culture. But the first step that I would ask teachers to do is, especially for those teachers who don't reside in the same communities as the schools are in, take a walk around the community. As Ms. mentioned, you know, culture is seen in food, is seen in music, beliefs, dance. But if you take a walk around the community and around the neighborhood, you'll see small corners of culture. Those are ways for you to start conversations with students. I love food, right? So if I ever meet anyone in person, we're going out to eat. But one thing that I love about food is the fact that every culture, food tastes different. It's spiced with something different. The vegetables are, you know, different. I tell my friends sometimes that I eat something different every single day. And yes, it's because I'm greedy, but also because to me, it enhances my palate. Understanding more about the diversity, understanding more about why people do the things that they do opens us up to acceptance. So I would say walk around the neighborhood. And if you're afraid to walk around the neighborhood, then you shouldn't be teaching those students. So walk around the neighborhood, stop at a store, see what that store is selling. Maybe don't bring your own lunch that day, buy lunch from outside, and figure out ways to have conversations with students based off the stores that you stopped in. Because those are small steps that lead to bigger opportunities for you to engage in conversations with students. What student doesn't like to talk about food? What student wouldn't want to talk about their grocery store or a monument? I remember I took an introduction to Brooklyn class, and I believe that was the best history teacher I had ever had. That was during my first master's program. And he was the best teacher because I've never read a book in that class. He took us on small tours every single class session. So I learned so much about the history of Brooklyn through my own eyes. And I was able to formulate my own understanding of the growth of Brooklyn through small tours. You can do that for yourself. And then from there, you get a sense of, you know, why our students react the way they do to certain things, why they may be coming to your class late. You may understand transportation systems. You may understand, you know, how long the line is at the grocery store in the morning, which is why they didn't make it to first period. But it gives you a deeper sense and understanding of who they are as individuals and where they come from, the different spots and locations of the neighborhood.
And are there any like activities that you think you can do with kids to help spark that and help them kind of share those differences with each other, even if they're really, really simple? You know, for a lot of teachers, it may be a good first step.
Yeah. So I would say I think that drawing is a relaxation tool. Have students draw you a map of their neighborhood.
Mm.
I did that before in elementary school, and I remember only drawing like stuff that I would walk past every day. But those were important things because that was the way that I was taught to walk home. So I knew where the tree was, and I knew where the school building was, and I knew where the park was. But also you'll get to see that connection between the students and where they live and what they deem as important, or what they deem as issues in their communities. A few months ago, I used Peer Deck for my students to actually create what they see on a daily basis. And of course, some of those images were negative, but to me, it gave me an understanding of, wow, you're really going through a lot. If you're seeing police brutality on a daily basis, and if you're unable to travel because of COVID, or you lost some family members and so you drew death, right? It gives you a sense of not only who they are, but basically be more open to the challenges that our students are facing. It's not always about what you're teaching. Students are experiencing a lot, especially now in 2021. It's not like how, I always say, it's not like how when my great grandmother went to school, and her only worry was washing her own uniform. Times are very different.
Yeah, we've got a awesome comment from Nairi that just came in just then. Nairi Clark saying, immerse yourself in where you are. You build community and the why of the behaviors that you're encountering. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that it's that's the kind of steps. I think those are the sort of steps which really, really do help make a difference. It's adding context to the behavior and the cultures of your students, and understanding that they're just multicultural, and that's it. I've got a multicultural class isn't quite enough. Acknowledging it isn't enough. It's more about building up context and immersing yourself in that. So I love that idea of having them draw something that's close to them, and having that as a way for you to actually relate to them and have them relate to you back as well. What in your opinion, Yaritza, is, and this is kind of quite personal, I guess, personally for you, what do you find the most frustrating thing about trying to bring what it is that you're trying to bring into classrooms? Like, what are the most frustrating restrictions or potholes that you've come across that you think that you could advise teachers on, and how to perhaps avoid or how to fight against in some cases?
So there's two. The first, and I believe I mentioned it today, was textbooks don't have the answer. So I know last year, a lot of folks, but I say a lot of folks were DMing me about, culture responsive teaching and what books I believe they should read. And a lot of my responses was, a book is not going to make you into a culture responsive teacher. And the reason why is because our classrooms are all different. And as I keep mentioning, our students are different. Books are based off of a set group of, people. And it's not necessarily the folks that we're teaching. And so people have to take their own steps. And the way you do that is just by being honest. And so that's the second thing. Folks don't want me to be honest. And I feel like if I can't be honest with you, then I can't help you, because you won't be open to any of the suggestions. And in honesty, we have to acknowledge that the inequities and equalities that exist in classes, it's not all about external factors. And when I say external factors, I mean socioeconomic statuses, rubrics, educational tools. We have to dig deeper and, uncover that uncomfortable issue of our own biases, our own stereotypes. We have to hold ourselves accountable for the fact that we've already figured out whether or not that student would be successful or unsuccessful in our class based off of their names, based off of their handwriting, based off their gender, based off of their race, based off of their GPA. And this is my favorite, based off of how they acted in someone else's classroom. So we tend to already open up situations or experiences with students that are very harmful. So it's not really just about the rubrics, because guess what? We can change the rubrics. It's not about socioeconomic statuses, because they've been different forever. It's not really about educational tools, because they're going to constantly change. It's about what you are portraying towards that student. What are you doing to make that student feel that they are included? What are you doing to enhance learning experiences within your classroom? Are you giving students the opportunity to have a roundtable, an honest discussion? Or are you the one that's, is it a teacher-centered classroom where you're the one asking all the questions, and it's like almost like speed dating, and then by the time the 45 minutes is up, the kids are like, what just happened? I don't know. We have to figure out ways to include students in our daily practices, but also we have to acknowledge that it's not that students don't understand the content that we're teaching. It's about the fact that students are unable to connect to the content that we're teaching. I always give the example about apple picking, and I think it's because I've never been apple picking. But if someone was to give me a text about apple picking now at the age of 33, of course, I would be able to understand that because I've seen it on TV. But if you were to ask me that when I was in junior high school or elementary school, I probably would have answered any questions geared to apple picking incorrectly because I didn't experience it. There was no way for me to imagine it in my mind. And a lot of the time as teachers, we always tell students, well, imagine you're in this position, or imagine you're playing this role. That's very difficult when you've never done it in real life. So I would say just be honest, accept honesty. Because that's the only way that you can become a culture responsive teaching. And also, it doesn't happen overnight. You can't just read 10 books this summer and say, hey, I'm a culture responsive teacher. And then you walk into your classroom and you ask students, okay, so how do you pronounce your name? And then all of a sudden you think that you're a culture responsive teacher. It's work. It's work. It's constant work. And it's about being open. It's about being true to who you are. And it's about acknowledging that you do have stereotypes. All of us do. But how do you move forward from that stereotype?
And do you feel like those stereotypes, there may be students who may already enter class feeling those stereotypes about themselves? You know what I mean? Like I know that for me, for example, I'm a Muslim, right? And like there was how I felt about saying that I was a Muslim before 9/11, and then how I felt after 9/11. You know what I mean? There's like two very different things there. Prior to 9/11, it was like, Muslim. Afterwards, at least for the next few years, it was very kind of like, maybe I shouldn't say that here, So how do you deal with students who may already be entering your class, let's say in the new school year, who already have like embedded, ingrained those stereotypes? How do you make them feel really, really comfortable, enough to just explore it and feel like, hey, I can be myself here?
I think it's about ensuring that you don't add on to the students feeling like they're being judged based off of a stereotype that they've experienced before. Every situation that you go into, whether if your school year begins in June or September, it should be a clean slate. So at the school that I work at now, or I service students at now, sometimes I get students more than once. And so if they failed me, if they failed the course last year, then I know in September, I have to give them a clean slate. I can't just say, hey, because you did poorly in June, you're going to do poorly now. Because if that's the case, and I'm doing the same exact thing all other teachers that they've had are doing or have done already. It's important that we give students clean slates, because guess what? When we mess up at work, we want admin to give us clear slates. We don't want to be held accountable for a mistake that we made last week or weeks before. So it's important to think of students as ourselves. How would you want to be treated in any kind of situation, especially at work, which is where you spend half of your time at?
And I have to ask this as well, Yaritza, because like I've learned a lot in this session in the last few weeks as well, particularly from you, and also just you kind of started me on a journey to do more research into this myself. How do we stop the phrase culturally responsive learning from becoming a buzzword? Because for me, it sounds like you're speaking common sense, right? It's not that difficult. I know that it's probably frustrating having people ask, what books can we read? And it's like, if you don't get it, like, you should kind of get this. Like, it's just about, exploring and understanding who your students are and taking that extra effort to make them feel comfortable and confident in your class. So how do we stop this from becoming a buzzword that gets, kind of a load of, how can I say this, misconceptions around it, and then before you know it, it's sort of swept under the rug?
So honestly, I feel like it has already become a buzzword. I believe I tweeted about that a few weeks ago too. So culture responsive teaching is something that has been around forever, right? Because when you think about the teachers who truly are invested in the craft, the teachers who truly are invested in their students, you take the time out to get to know your students, and then you make sure that your lesson is tied to that student, whether you call it differentiation or multiple entry points. That's culture responsive teaching, right? You're figuring out ways the students learns best. You're putting in some mathematical equations with things the students like to do, whether if it's hands-on or building. But I feel like now that we have this coined phrase, culture responsive teaching, folks are using it up. It's almost like putting syrup on pancakes or honey on pancakes. You're seeing it everywhere. You're seeing it everywhere now. Even school districts are, creating different platforms that state culture responsive teaching. And what I would say is, to truly understand it is just to acknowledge that. It's to acknowledge that you're putting a student's life experiences and interests together into what you're teaching. You're weaving it together to make this great piece of work or art that we call our pedagogical practice. And so what I would say is, at this point, everyone's going to keep saying culture responsive teaching. Just know that it's easier than you may have assumed it was. It's literally about showing respect for another person by acknowledging their differences and what connects them to the universe.
And just very lastly as well, Yaritza, if you could recommend like one thing for an educator to do, in the next school year to make minorities or children of color, kids of different cultures feel more comfortable in their classrooms, like what would that one thing be? That one kind of starting off point?
I think that as educators, we don't reflect enough. And you do have where some teachers reflect on the curricula or on how their lesson went. I would say reflect on who you are as an educator. Ask yourself a few questions about, what are some steps that you're willing to take to advocate for your students. But then also go into day one with zero expectations. We sometimes we plan all summer, and then you have all of these expectations, but you've never met the students. How do you prepare for a group of students that you've never met before? So you come in with these set of expectations, and your students are totally different than what you prepared for. So I would say go in zero expectations, acknowledge that your kids are all uniquely different, and ask them how to, pronounce their names before you try it. Then from there, you can move on with, I know some people jump straight into the curriculum. Some people give pre-assessments, which doesn't determine anything. Yes, you heard it from me first. But take the first week to get to know who your students are, because they'll tell you some things that's so fascinating about how they learn and what interests them.
Yaritza, thank you so much. Honestly, this has been an absolutely phenomenal conversation. Like the hour it's just gone by so quickly. There's so much to unpack. Like I'm gonna have to go away now and watch this again and again and again. And I know that everyone's gonna do the same as well. Honestly, everybody, thank you in the chat as well for sharing your thoughts and your ideas with us. We really appreciate it. I think that this is a subject which is, it's something which can make a few of us uncomfortable, because I think it may expose certain things that we may do in our lives that we're not necessarily mindful about. And I think that, we shouldn't get too defensive about the way that we're doing things. Quite often, just because we've done certain things the same way for so long, doesn't mean that that's the right way. And I think that the points that Yaritza, spoke about tonight really echo all of the research and the work and the life experience that, she's had. And I can't wait to see some of the awesome stuff that you do in the future as well, Yaritza. I'll definitely be watching this again. Everybody can follow Yaritza on Twitter as well, at INC_YV. Marcus, if you could put that in the chat for me, that would be fantastic. And yeah, I think that just following your Twitter is enough to kind of get a good idea and spark a little bit of interest. But I'm gonna leave. I mean, we've had it's been an incredible week so far. Like we've had so many amazing sessions from so many amazing people. This one in particular is one where you really are gonna reflect on it. I know that I am, but I wanted to give the last word to you, Yaritza, like any message that you might have to the educator community, because I know this is going to get watched a lot as well in loads of places around the world where this isn't their time zone. And they're going to come back tomorrow and they're going to watch it all. So do you have any message for, like, you know, the world, essentially, the world of educators that we've got joining us at Wakelet?
First, I want to say thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Wakelet, for having me. But if I had to say anything to the educators around the world, it would be teaching isn't easy. It's a profession that many folks tend to stay away from, and it's because you have to be open, you have to show vulnerability, and you have to be willing to change anything that, you know, is not really tied to who your students are. And I believe that's honestly what a culturally responsive teacher is. So put your best foot forward. And honestly, if you have to be that advocate and you have to ask questions and you have to dig deep to make connections with families and students, then you're honestly on the right path to becoming a culturally responsive teacher.
Thank you so much, Yaritza. I know that you've had a profound effect on the educators who are watching this today. You know, with all sincerity, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to come and join us today and speak about this. And I really, really hope that we get a chance to work together in the future and, you know, spread this message to as many people as possible, because I think it's a powerful one, it's a timely one, and it's a one that many, many people need to hear right now. So honestly, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Yaritza. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Goodbye, everybody. Join us tomorrow for some more amazing sessions. And yeah, I mean, that was honestly one of the most phenomenal sessions that I've ever attended. There's so much to unpack. There's so many things that are going to be on my mind now on my drive home. And I hope that everybody, you know, comes back to this session and rewatches it. And of course, follow Yaritza on Twitter as well, because the things that she's sharing are incredible. And you know, please don't forget to share the things that you've learned today with us on Twitter using the hashtag Wakelet Community Week. You know, there's so many people who will be inspired to come and watch this video because of the things that you're tweeting out. So I really appreciate it. Hey, everybody, thank you so much. It has been another fantastic day of learning for all of us, and I just can't wait to see you all again tomorrow. So stay safe, and yeah, I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Bye-bye.